of August Historic Issue 1 vote. I am Mario, the president of the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area. I would like to thank the Dayton Daily News for taking on the role of media sponsor for this program. Their promotion of this event has been fabulous and phenomenal. I also want to thank those who have made donations to this campaign to educate our community, not only on the importance of the issue, but also to inform them that there is, in fact, an August election. Many of us are going about our day starting conversations with everyone we meet. Do you know there's a special election in August? Dismayingly, the answer is often no. One League member told me she is now asking that question of people who pop up in her dreams. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, albeit political organization. We do not endorse or oppose any candidate or political party, but we do take positions on issues that impact democracy and voters' rights, including Issue 1. The League of Women Voters and the Dayton Daily News have joined Ohio's former governors, both Democrat and Republican, 5 attorneys general from both sides of the aisle, as well as 240 statewide organizations to come out against the passage of Issue 1. Tonight's discussion will provide you with information about how Issue 1, if approved, will affect the governance of Ohio for decades to come and the impact it will have on citizens' freedom to determine their own futures. I would like to take a moment to recognize some elected officials who are joining us this evening. I think Paul Brunner, have you arrived? And I know Daryl Fairchild is expected, Dayton City Commissioner. A special welcome to Jen Miller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, who will provide closing remarks. She's up front. We know that many of you are coming with questions. In the interest of time, we ask that you jot those down on the index card you received when you arrived. When you are ready, please hold up your card and a League member will collect it from you. If it has not been answered during the program, we'll ask that the presenters address your concerns. We'll get to as many questions as we can. And now I am pleased to introduce you to our presenters, Governor Bob Taft and Michael Curtin. Bob Taft began his career in public service as a Peace Corps volunteer. He served as an elected official in Ohio for 30 years as a member of the state legislature, a county commissioner, Ohio Secretary of State, and served as governor of Ohio between 1999 and 2007. Former Governor Taft is currently a distinguished research associate with the University of Dayton, teaching political science courses and working with state and federal internship programs. Michael Curtin retired from the Columbus Dispatch after a 38-year career as a reporter, editor, and associate publisher. He also served as president, COO, and vice chairman of the Dispatch Printing Company. During much of his newspaper career, Mr. Curtin specialized in the coverage of state and local government, public policy, and electoral politics. Following his retirement from the Dispatch, Mr. Curtin served 2 terms from 2013 through 2016 in the Ohio House as the representative from the 17th District, serving the west and south sides of Columbus. He served as a member of the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission, which made recommendations for updating the state's foundational document. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Nick Kirkman, Community Impact Editor for the Dayton Daily News. He is a native Daytonian and a proud graduate of Dayton Public Schools. Among other duties, he co-hosts Community Voices, a series of monthly discussions that focus on topics important to the Dayton region. Nick.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to moderate this really important event. I am the Community Impact Editor for the Dayton Daily News. It is a pleasure to see everyone. I'd like to see you all as either past or future contributors to my Ideas and Voices section, which we very much appreciate hearing your voices on topics important to you. So if you want to submit something to voice a solution to a problem you've identified in your community, that is what we are here for. We're here to be a platform to hear your solutions. So it is an honor to serve in that capacity, and it's an honor to be here this evening to moderate this panel discussion. So I'm going to kick it over to some questions. I have the first question for Mr. Curtin. At the 1912 Ohio Constitutional Convention, the current method by which Ohio citizens could propose amendments to the Ohio Constitution was adopted. Would you give us a 2-minute historical overview on how that came to be and what the political climate was like in 1912 compared to today? And I know that that's a tall order in 2 minutes.
I time myself, Nick, it might be like 2 minutes and 28 seconds if you don't mind. Thank you for moderating, Nick, and thanks to the Dayton Daily News, and thank you, what a tremendous crowd for this issue. So it's our honor to be here. And now to answer the question, I hope my 2 minutes hasn't started yet, Nick. To understand Ohio's 1912 Constitutional Convention, we must first understand the state's political and social climates on the late 1800s and into the 20th century. In the 1880 census, 2/3 of Ohioans still lived on farms. By the 1920 census, just 40 years later, nearly 2/3 lived in cities. A tremendous transformation in 40 years, from 2/3 on farms to 2/3 in cities. A complete reversal. And during that 40 years, Ohio's population nearly doubled, approaching 6 million in that 1920 census. That incredible transformation was driven by the Industrial Revolution, waves of European immigration, and the resulting rapid urbanization of Ohio. With such a large majority of voters now living in cities in 1920, political bosses, of course, emerged to deliver elections, for a price, of course. With the Industrial Revolution, the big money at the time belonged to business tycoons in iron, steel, coal, oil, machinery, banking, utilities, and railroads. Ohio had become an industrial dynamo, and the wealth creation of these big industries was incredible. About 1% of the population controlled 50% of the wealth at that time. This new class of industrialists were willing to pay for the type of government they wanted. Ohio had no prohibition on corporate cash in politics, and cash was used through those political bosses to elect office holders and to buy their loyalty. Many elected officials literally were on company payrolls. There was no prohibition for it. What big business wanted more than anything else was little or no government regulation, and that's what they got. As more and more Ohioans picked up on this corruption, a reform movement began in both political parties. The Ohio Progressive Republican League and the Ohio Democratic Progressive League were the driving forces behind the calling for a state constitutional convention in 1912. Those coalitions in the two parties weren't united on all issues, but they were united on demanding more citizen participation in government to take on this corruption. And what was going on in Ohio was going on in many other states. Between 1900 and 1920, 13 states held state constitutional conventions to drive a reform agenda. Of all the reform goals, none was important as the initiative and referendum, to give citizens the power to override unresponsive and corrupt legislatures. My last two paragraphs here, Nick. In November 1910, Ohioans voted overwhelmingly for a state constitutional convention by 9-1. 9-1 they voted for a state constitutional convention. And in November 1911, Ohioans elected 119 delegates to come to Columbus for that state constitutional convention. Why 119 delegates? Because at the time there were 119 House districts, one per House district. The convention was held in Columbus during the first half of 1912. The delegates entertained 340 separate proposals for amendments. From those 340, they winnowed them down to 42. And when Ohioans went to the polls in the fall of 1912, consider this, you're voting on one issue on August 8th, they were pulling the lever on 42 separate issues to amend their state constitution, and they approved 34 of them. None of the 34 was as important as the initiative and referendum. It passed with 57.5% of the vote, and Ohioans have used that power responsibly for 111 years. Nick, I think I went over a little 2 minutes, but hopefully that suffices.
You did a fantastic job. I thought that was a fantastic overview. Governor Taft, do you have anything to add to that history?
I always learn a lot listening to Mike Curtin.
Well, thank you very much for that very speedy overview. Governor Taft, the league has been fielding calls from voters who are confused about what they're voting on in August. Can you outline the current requirements to amend the Ohio Constitution?
I'd really like to thank the League of Women Voters, first of all, for organizing this, and you, Nick, and the Dayton Daily News has done a great job of publicizing it. And I'm so impressed that all of you are here on a Wednesday evening in July of all times. And you know, it gives me hope that democracy is still alive and well here in the Dayton area. But just to summarize, you're probably well informed, but I think it is important that we all know, you know, what do we have now and what would it be if issue 1 were to pass. So right now, there are 2 different ways of amending Ohio's Constitution. Legislators, by a vote of 3/5 of its members, can propose an amendment to the Constitution. If approved by a majority of voters who vote, it takes effect. Number 2, citizens may propose an amendment by initiative petition. And that too, if it gets to the ballot, passes with just a majority vote. However, there are a lot of challenges and hurdles really to put that kind of initiative on the ballot, even under the current Ohio Constitution. Those submitting signatures have to get those of electors equal to 10% of the votes cast in the last gubernatorial election, which would be over 400,000 signatures right now. Those have to be submitted within 125 days of a November election day. In addition, at least 5% of the vote of 44 out of Ohio's 88 counties must be represented by those electors. So petitioners have to go out and collect in 44 separate counties at least signatures from electors representing 5% of that county's vote for governor in the last election. So that's substantial. There is some relief, which is that there is a 10-day cure period in which petitioners can gather additional signatures if they initially filed an insufficient number of signatures. So that's what we have today. Would you like me to also describe the
I would, if you wouldn't mind giving us the wording of the what voters will expect to see on the ballot in August.
Right. So you're probably somewhat aware of this as well, but the most obvious change is that if issue 1 passes, it would require that any proposed amendment to the Constitution, whether coming from the legislature or coming by initiative petition, would have to receive the approval of at least 60% of eligible voters voting on that amendment in order to be approved. So you're going from a simple majority up to 60%. Secondly, it would require 5% of the electors from each of Ohio's 88 counties to be represented on those petitions. So those, if you're trying to put a measure on the ballot, you'd have to go to every single county, and you'd have to collect in each of those 88 counties the signatures of electors representing 5% of the total vote in that county for governor in the last preceding election. And then finally, the amendment eliminates the 10-day cure period that I just mentioned is an existing law, the existing Constitution, so that after that deadline, no additional signatures may be submitted. So it is a much higher burden to get a petition signature, a petition on the ballot to amend the Constitution if issue 1 were to pass.
Thank you, Governor Taft. And I'm going to ask you, in your opinion, there was a challenge over the wording itself of the ballot language that was contested in the Ohio Supreme Court. But given the new language that they did settle on, do you think that voters will be able to make an informed decision if they only see the ballot language?
The simple answer to that is, in my opinion, it's no. And that's why it's so important that we all educate voters, because the ballot language itself does not inform voters of the changes from current law. It just includes what the new law would be. So voters wouldn't know majority to 60%, wouldn't know 44 to 88 counties, wouldn't know the cure period is being eliminated. So that's, I think, the major flaw in the description. And in addition, there's been some attention to the heading or the title of the amendment. And the first three words are elevating the standards to qualify for. Elevating the standards, to me, sounds like something really good and not neutral. I don't know how Mike Curtin feels about it, but you know, the Supreme Court blessed that, but I don't think it's neutral language. For example, increasing the standard. There's other ways that could have been written. I think that would have been more neutral. That's my own view.
Thank you very much, Governor Taft. Mike Curtin, did you have any thoughts on the language as written?
I agree with the governor.
Governor Taft, another question. The timing of this special election has been questioned because traditionally there is low voter participation in August. Additionally, another election places a huge burden on our boards of election and will cost taxpayers between $15 to $20 million, or even more, because the boards of election anticipate a higher turnout than last summer. What is your opinion of the legislature asking Ohioans to decide on such an important issue now instead of the November general election?
Well, your question really raises my number one concern about the issue. This is a fundamental change in Ohio's voting rights. You've heard the change in the amendment. That's a big change. And I just think it's a major mistake to approve or disapprove such a change at the lowest turnout election that we have. You've probably seen that last year in the special election in August, I think it was less than 10% of voters turned out. I was talking with Mike Curtin before about predictions. You know, this year we know there's going to be a ton of advertising on both sides, so turnout will be up somewhat. But I would be shocked if there was a 30% voter turnout, and it could well be less. So if you have 30% voter turnout, that means you're approving a fundamental change in Ohio's Constitution with just 15% of the people voting for it. And I think that's a real mistake. This kind of a change should be approved by voters, in my opinion, at a November election when turnout would be at its highest point. And you don't need just to listen to me on this. You may have heard that just in December, the state legislature voted to eliminate the August election. The sponsor of the bill to do that was State Representative Thomas Hall, a Butler County, just to the south of here, Republican. And what he said at that time was that local governments game the system in August by seeking to approve tax increases during low turnout special elections when most voters aren't paying attention. So, you know, I would describe this as perhaps, you know, state leaders trying to game the system for whatever reasons they want to make it harder for citizens to put an initiative on the ballot and to approve it. The Ohio Secretary, I used to be Secretary of State, Chief Elections Officer in Ohio. Our current Republican Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, testified on that bill in December that to eliminate the August elections. He said, August elections are bad for taxpayers, elections officials, and the civic health of the state, largely because few people show up. That means just a handful of voters end up making big decisions. The side, and this is the quote, the side that wins is often the one that has a vested interest in the passage of the issue up for consideration. Secretary of State LaRose told senators, and then he went on to say, this isn't how democracy is supposed to work. I completely agree with Frank LaRose in that statement.
Thank you, Governor Taft. Mike Curtin, how many citizen-led ballot initiatives have been proposed over the years? And of those, how many have been successful?
Let me give you a recent view and a long-term view. The recent view of the last 15 years from 2007 through 2022, 52 distinct organizations filed paperwork 88 times with the Ohio Attorney General seeking permission to take initiative petitions to the street to gather signatures to hopefully qualify an amendment for the ballot. Why 88 submissions from 52 groups? Because the Attorney General often rejects submissions as insufficiently complete, is not fully disclosive. And so those 52 organizations started the process to go to the streets to gather signatures to try to place an amendment on the ballot. Of those 52, how many were successful in actually getting an amendment to the ballot, getting those signatures from 44 counties, 500,000 or more signatures to get the 400 or so thousand you need. Six of those 52 organizations actually got to the ballot in the last 15 years. Of those six, 3 won and 3 lost. And the proponents of state issue 1, the majority party in the legislature right now, supported 2 of those 3 winning issues. The 2011 Freedom to Choose Healthcare Amendment and the 2017 Rights of Crime Victims Amendment. So 3 wins in 52 attempts, about an average of 6%. It's hard to do. It's very hard to get to the ballot and then to win once you get there. The long view, we've had the initiative right in the state since 1912, so the first time Ohioans could use it was in 1913. And if you look at that long span of Ohio history, there have been 71 citizen-led initiatives make it to the ballot over those 111 years, and of those 71, 19 were approved for about an average of just over 1/4, about 27%. So it's difficult to get there, and it's difficult to win.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to ask you too, which of those do you consider to have significantly impacted the lives of Ohio citizens? And would those that were most significant have even been added to the Constitution with a 60% threshold?
I'll give you 5 or 6 historically significant amendments that won, but with less than 60%. We wouldn't have if the 60% threshold had been in place back then. The first one, the very first amendment Ohioans approved after they got the right to do it in 1912 was home rule on liquor sales. Liquor was a huge issue in the late 1800s and early 1900s prior to Prohibition. In the lead up to Prohibition, liquor was a huge political issue in this country and in this state. And in 1913, Ohioans went to the streets and they qualified an issue for the ballot to allow people to vote their home precincts wet or dry. We still have that today. You know, we have the power to determine whether our home precincts, our neighborhoods, will be wet or dry. That passed with 50.6% of the vote. The classification on real estate, property, all property used to be taxed at the same uniform rate, even though there's many different types of property: real property, personal property, tangible, intangible personal property. The Ohioans voted to allow the legislature to classify different types of property at different rates, and that passed with 52.5%. The revered 10 mil limit on unvoted property taxes, which is still in effect today. Our taxing authorities can impose unvoted taxes beyond 10 mils without your consent. That passed in 1933 at 59.7%. Home rule for counties, 53.3%. Elimination of straight ticket voting, 57.3%. Before that, you could vote a straight ticket by pulling the lever one time. Party bosses love that system. The citizens upended it. They said, no, we want to vote separately in each office. That passed with 57.3%. And lastly, Nick, I'm mindful of not filibustering your entire evening here. The establishment of the minimum wage in 2006 passed with 56.6%. The minimum wage is an issue in this campaign because Ohio Restaurant Association is supporting the yes side. The current minimum wage in Ohio for non-tipped employees is $10.10 an hour. For tipped employees, it's half that. It's $5.05 an hour. The minimum wage is always an issue, and it's an issue in this campaign.
Thank you, Mike. I think those are some fantastic examples, and yeah, just highlighting kind of those razor-thin margins that those wouldn't have passed with 60%. Governor Taft, if passed, how would this amendment affect citizens' ability to get initiatives on the ballot in terms of cost, time, and human resources? How will eliminating the cure period affect citizens' efforts? And will anything change for legislators who want to amend the Constitution?
I want to ask Mike also to comment on this. We were chatting about this issue before and talking about small counties, but it's already difficult to get an amendment. Over 400,000 signatures now are required. You have to go to 44 counties to get those signatures. So that's a massive undertaking. It may require, if you're going to pay people to collect signatures, it may require a matter of millions of dollars to get that done, and a lot of time. And what you're doing now is you're basically doubling that requirement to 88 counties and eliminating the cure period. And so it's going to be exceedingly difficult, I think, for citizens to get amendments on the ballot unless they are extremely deep-pocketed, unless they have the resources. If you've got a big payoff down the line, whether it was like casino gambling or marijuana, whatever it might be, maybe those groups would be able to go out and collect enough signatures and do it in all 88 counties and get it done. But it's going to be exceedingly expensive. It's going to be very hard for citizens groups to do it all on their own. Mike, once you mentioned what we were chatting about, was it Benton County I think you were talking about? Kind of interesting.
Ohio is one of 18 states among our 50 who has a constitution allowing citizen-led initiatives, 18 of 50. Of those 18, 3 tie the process of getting enough signatures to qualify for the ballot to counties. Ohio is only one of 3 of 18 states that tie the signature requirement to counties. Most states tie it to congressional districts or state legislative districts. Ohio at 44 counties is already the most stringent of the 3 states that tie signature requirements to counties. If we go to 88 counties, it by far and away will be the most stringent state. And my concern about an 88 county requirement is it enables any one county to essentially veto what the other 87 counties want to do. And I don't want to pick on Benton County, but I'll use Benton County as an example because it's our smallest county by population. 13,000 people as of our last census, 2020 census, about 13,000 residents of Benton County, which is about 1/1000th of the population of the state of Ohio. Well, a Just Say No campaign, just don't sign the petition campaign in Benton County with 1/1000th of the population of the entire state could exercise veto authority over what 99.99% of the rest of Ohioans and the other 87 counties would like a chance to vote on. And let's not pick on Benton County. Ohio has 26 counties with less than 40,000 population, 0.3% of 1% of Ohio's population. Should any one county have that kind of disproportionate influence over the rest of Ohio? I say no. And in 1912, this very issue was debated. The 119 delegates to our 1912 State Constitutional Convention didn't want the big counties overpowering the small counties. And they wrestled with this for days and days and days in the first half of 1912. And their compromise, and I think it was a great compromise, was let's make it 44. That will require petition signatures to get out all across Ohio and be representative of Ohio. That doesn't mean they won't count. They won't collect signatures in the other 44, but they have to meet the signature requirements in 44 to meet the threshold. And I think that's worked well for Ohio. In my personal view, as an 88 county requirement is an attempt to disable the initiative process itself.
Thank you both very much. Mike, the next question is for you. What aspect within issue 1 would have any, what aspect within issue 1 would have any effect on out-of-state special interest groups trying to influence Ohio voters?
I think the out-of-state argument is largely a myth. If you look at the 71 citizen-led initiatives since 1913, and you can look at it on the Secretary of State's website, they're all listed. Almost all of those issues have been homegrown in the fertile grassroots of Ohio. The big exception will be the 2009 casino amendment, which we can talk about if you want to, Nick, or if in your Q&A you want to talk about the 2009 casino amendment, because that teaches important lessons. But these have largely been homegrown amendments. And you have to remember, the Constitution only allows petition signatures to be Ohio residents. So if an out-of-state interest comes in, they have to hire Ohioans, first of all, to circulate petitions. And obviously, the only signatures that count are signatures of valid signatures of registered voters. So Ohioans circulate the petitions, Ohioans sign the petitions, and it's an Ohio-led process. Now, where does out-of-state interest come in? Money. Because of Ohio's large place in the 50 states here, We've always been a barometer state for most of our history. Ohio matters more than a lot of states. And so what goes in Ohio can be seen as a leading indicator for what's going to sell or not sell elsewhere. And so when big issues like this one do qualify for the ballot, there will be big money coming from out of state, no question about it, on both sides. And if you want to talk about money, we can talk about money. But that's where the out-of-state influence is, not in the qualification of the issue itself for the ballot. That's Ohio-led, Ohio-driven, and Ohio-approved.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mike. Governor Taft, one of the arguments made in favor of this amendment is that it will keep Ohio's Constitution from being cluttered with frivolous amendments. Do you see this as a problem that needs to be solved?
First of all, I'd like to just add to what Mike said. One of the funders of the effort to influence legislators to put this issue on the ballot in the first place is a out-of-state billionaire from Illinois who was funding ads, and so there's always that influence around. There are a lot of obsolete provisions in Ohio's Constitution. If issue 1 passes, it's going to get harder to get rid of obsolete provisions and clean up our Constitution with that 60% requirement. For example, right now in the Ohio Constitution, Article 1, Section 6 says, "There shall be no slavery in this state, nor involuntary servitude, unless for punishment of a crime." So basically, we have a Constitution now that says there can be involuntary servitude under certain circumstances. Well, State Representative Phil Plummer from Dayton and a bipartisan group of legislators are proposing an amendment to the Constitution from the legislature that would get rid of that provision. But if issue 1 passes, it's going to be even harder to get rid of that provision because of the 60% requirement. If we're trying to clean up the Constitution, I think it's going to, and Mike and I were both on the Modernization Commission, and there's a lot of obsolete stuff in there. There's a lot of provisions we might want to take out, and it will be more difficult. Or, for example, let's say right now, we can talk about casino gambling, and there's a lot of concern about the issues, but let's say there's an effort to remove from the Ohio Constitution some of the rights and privileges of casino operators. If the public turns against that, it's going to be much harder to do that if a minority of 40% can block that kind of an effort. So if we're trying to clean up the Constitution, I would say, leave it at a simple majority for approving amendments, whether they're submitted by the legislature or by referendum.
Nick, if I could add just one quick postscript. The length of the Constitution is an issue, but the primary reason that it's so long is Article 8 of the Constitution, which is the article on public debt and public works, accounts for 1/4 of the entire length. I'm sorry, accounts for 40% of the entire length of the Constitution. Why would one article account for 40% of the entire length? Because we still have a $750,000 debt limit in our Constitution from 1851, and that requires governors and legislatures to seek voter approval for bond issues when they want to borrow money to go build highways, roads, schools, basic infrastructure, parks. You're all used to voting on bond issues. We've been voting on bond issues a long time. When those bond issues are approved, that language gets added to Article 8 of the Constitution, the authorization language and so forth. We still have a lot of dead language in Article 8 for programs that were paid off a long time ago. And a mere amendment, if the legislature would ever get around to it, and the commission recommended that they do, to put an issue on the ballot, an amendment on the ballot, just to get rid of all the dead language. And if the legislature would see fit to do that, it'll be an easy slam dunk yes vote to get rid of dead language. It doesn't mean anything anymore. We could reduce the length of the Ohio Constitution by 25%.
Thank you both. I'm going to work in an audience question that kind of relates to the outside money a little bit. There's no doubt that, and apologies if the handwriting is throwing me up a little bit, but the commenter can also correct me if I have anything wrong. There is no doubt current Constitution facilitators, the outside money is getting involved in Ohio politics. Forgetting about the pro-abortion or pro-life issue, changing the requirement to 60% wouldn't end citizens' wouldn't end citizens' rights. Do you agree?
Citizens' right to spend money? It's a question about money, right? Money and, no?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm sorry. Did the person that presented the question want to clarify? Yes, sir. Got it. So changing the requirement to 60% wouldn't end citizens' rights to vote on issues.
Correct. It would not end your right to vote on issues at all. We'd still have the right to vote on issues. It would just make them a lot tougher to approve.
Thank you. We're going to continue to work those in as best we can. So thank you for your comment cards, and we're going to get to those as best we can. This question goes to Governor Taft. Each living governor, both Republican and Democrat, as well as former attorneys general from both sides of the aisle, have spoken out against issue 1. Why?
I'd like to start answering that question by following up on the point that Mike just made, which is that amending the Ohio Constitution is not quite the same as amending the United States Constitution. And the major reason is because of this $750,000 debt limit that was put in the Constitution in 1851, which means anytime a governor wants, or the legislature wants to propose a new initiative for issuing debt to invest in schools or parks or whatever purpose, it has to go to the voters because it's going to exceed that $750,000. So a couple of my major initiatives, the Clean Ohio Fund and Third Frontier Project, which have been well received, have been reauthorized by voters over the period of years, were first approved by less than, I got the legislature to submit them to the voters. They were approved by less than 60% of the vote. So those programs, two of my major initiatives, would not have occurred. And so I think that it's short-sighted, and I'm not sure legislators understand this, that they're really constraining their own ability and future governors' ability to make strategic investments in Ohio to improve our quality of life that might exceed that debt limit. If they go to 60%, I think it's going to be very difficult to get any of those money issues enacted. So that's my number one concern. Number two is, as I said at the beginning, I just think a good reason to vote against this issue is that it shouldn't be submitted to voters in an August election, a very low turnout election. If we're going to make this kind of a major change, it should be done. Hopefully, the ideal time to do it would be next year at the presidential election in November, when you're going to have the maximum turnout of voters. This is a kind of a change that really needs to be considered by all the people that go and vote in a presidential election. If we're going to make such a drastic change that could affect the ability of future governors to invest in the state, the ability to clean up our Constitution, and the ability to enact change as circumstances evolve and demand.
Nick, if I could just add a postscript, I do have a couple illustrative statistics on bond issues. Bond issues really became a thing in the post-World War II era as Ohio boomed. And from 1955 to the present day, the legislature has placed 29 bond issues on the statewide ballot. At the current 50% plus one simple majority, 19 have won, 10 have failed. So it's not easy, first of all. The parties need to be united. Business and labor need to be united. It needs to be an understandable purpose. Otherwise, they don't win. So that's 65%. 19 wins and 29 efforts, 65% passage ratio. If a 60% threshold had been in place over that period of time, we would have had 11 wins and 18 losses for a 38% passage rate. So the difference between simple majority and 60% on bond issues over that span of time, 65% to 38%. We wouldn't have had Governor Taft's Third Frontier program, which jump-started Ohio in high-tech economic development, biotech, all sorts of fantastic things. And that's, he can't say it, I can. That's one of his greatest legacies as governor.
Thank you. I'd like to add one more point. This is kind of a personal how I feel thing, but I don't know what Mike would think about this, but the second time I ran, when I ran for re-election as governor in 2002, I did not have a very strong opponent. not a lot of visibility, not a well-funded campaign. And my victory margin in Ohio at that time was 56%. And I thought that was a landslide. Oh, that's not bad, 56 to 44, it's pretty good, right? That should be sufficient, I think, to approve amendments to the Ohio Constitution. And just one more point, and it may come up, but this is kind of big thinking, but Mike talked about the reasons why we amended the Constitution in 1912 to allow for voter-initiated changes in the Constitution as a check on special interests who were controlling everything back then. Well, I think today we have a very polarized electorate. We have heavily gerrymandered districts in Ohio. And one of the results of that is that I think we do have a tendency, maybe not just Ohio, other states too. States are either very Democratic, very Republican. Ohio is very Republican. There's a tendency for extreme legislation, and where there needs to be some kind of a voter check on what legislators enact. And we've got, right now, Republicans have a majority of 67 out of 99 members of the Ohio House. Almost half of them, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, almost half of those members didn't have opposition when they ran. And the majority of the rest won their districts by 60% or more. So there really isn't a general election between a Republican and a Democrat. The important election becomes the primary election, which is a very low voter turnout election itself. And that means that certain, special interest groups, they're citizen groups, could be pro-life, could be pro-choice, could be pro-gun, could be anti-gun, but those groups can have an extraordinary influence in the primary election, either certain groups on the Republican side, certain groups on the Democratic side. And that means that those legislators are listening to only a very small portion of the electorate, which means that there is an opportunity to pass pretty extreme legislation where there may need to be some kind of a check through citizen-initiated amendments to the Ohio Constitution. I think one example of that would be the Reproductive Freedom Amendment and abortion right now. Poll came out last week, Gallup. I think it's about 70% of Americans, would be in favor of abortion being legal in the first trimester. But Ohio has a heartbeat bill, a 6-week bill, which is in law right now. So that bill was passed by a very partisan legislature. It's not what the majority of Ohioans probably want. I'm not sure how, I'm going to have, if that reproductive freedom issue goes to the ballot, I'm going to have to study that very carefully because it's very complicated and I'm going to have to understand before I decide how to vote. But I can understand why that amendment is being proposed when you have such an extreme abortion law written right now by Ohio legislators. And so I'm saying that's pretty complicated, but I'm saying that's a reason why there should be a check on legislators, because there's a tendency towards extreme legislation now, not just in Ohio, but across the country.
This is another audience question, so feel free to jump in, whomever wants to ask. Do you believe that due to the added restrictions that this issue puts on legislators and government initiatives, it will detract the business and growth in Ohio long term?
Will it detract from, well, that's awfully hard to answer. Businesses are not monoliths. There are businesses for issue one, there are businesses against issue one. The Ohio Chamber of Commerce has endorsed state issue one. The Ohio Restaurant Association has endorsed state issue one. NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business, Ohio, which represents small businesses, have endorsed issue one. On the other hand, the bulk of business-related organizations, the Ohio Business Roundtable, the Ohio Manufacturers Association, the Ohio Council of Retail Merchants, have stayed neutral. not wanting to get involved in this thing. And just last week, an open letter signed by about 3 dozen CEOs, COOs, former chairmen, former CEOs of leading Ohio companies issued a letter in opposition to issue one. So it's all over the map, Nick. You know, different business leaders, different folks in business have different views, you know, on this issue. My concern, and I think the concern that business leaders ought to have, is we all preach best practices. You know, businesses preach best practices from the boardroom down to the shop room. You know, whether you're a college, whether you're a dry cleaners, whether you're any entity, you know, your industry researches and promotes best practices. You preach best practices to your employees. We ought to insist on best practices in government as well. And Governor Taft mentioned polls. Every poll over the last 20 to 30 years has shown a declining public confidence in our core governmental institutions, from the U.S. Supreme Court all the way down to city councils. We have to turn that tide at some point. The level of public cynicism toward government is at an all-time high. Election denialism is at an all-time high. I mean, in January of 2021, for the first time in the nation's history, we had an insurrection in the nation's capital trying to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. First time in our nation. We have to break this fever. We have to turn this around. And my concern in terms of this not being a best practice, this is a worst practice. In 220 years of statehood, no General Assembly ever has scheduled such a monumental issue for an August special election ballot. It's never happened before. So why? Why would, you know, previous General Assemblies have always had the good judgment and the good faith, the good grace to schedule big issues for general elections and usually November elections. That's my real concern about the lack of good faith and the lack of best practices in government now, and even put this on the August ballot.
Governor Taft, did you have anything to add?
I think that was a really beautifully said, and you know, it's just not the right time for voters to decide. Again, I'm going to be shocked if there's 30% turnout.
Appreciate it. Another question from the audience. Would taxes go up to repair infrastructure and for economic development if bonds are less likely to pass?
Taxes wouldn't go up.
What?
He said if bonds don't pass, will taxes go up? I don't think so.
Oh, if it doesn't pass, will taxes go up? No.
Correct. Would taxes go up to repair infrastructure and for economic development if bonds are less likely to pass?
Well, what you would do is you would take the state out of the game of assisting localities in building their infrastructure. I mean, we've always had a lot of state-local partnerships. Cities and counties and townships can't build major roadways themselves for the most part. We've depended on actually federal, state, and local partnerships. The federal highway system was 90% federal, 5% state, 5% local, Governor, if I remember correctly. That's how we build our federal interstate system. When you look at major infrastructure projects, water, sewer, airports, you know, these depend, for the most part, on shared burden. So no one level of government is overwhelmed. And without state participation, if we kneecap bond issues, then we're going to leave our cities, counties, and townships in a very difficult spot in being able to afford the infrastructure improvements that we've come to expect in the modern era.
And just to follow up with a specific example, when I became governor, I was faced with a decision by the Ohio Supreme Court that our school funding system was unconstitutional. A major part of that was the deplorable school buildings that had not been repaired, were very old, very obsolete, sometimes unhealthy for students. And so we initiated a major school rebuilding program throughout the state of Ohio with state funds matching local dollars. It was about $4 billion during my administration. We could never have done that program to update Ohio's school buildings for the 21st century if there had not been authority in the Ohio Constitution to issue debt for that purpose. I was fortunate that there was. And so that's an example that I would cite. And number two, there are limits on excessive debt. And there was a time when Ohio did drive itself into debt and all kinds of problems with canals and so forth. But right now, the Ohio Constitution has provision that says the debt service that the state pays on its debt for any 1 year cannot exceed 5% of its revenues for that year. So we have checks and balances and controls on not issuing excessive debt. But there's no way we could make the kind of investments that we're making in trails, in schools, in other infrastructure that benefits Ohioans for years to come without that kind of authority to issue some debt, which cannot be obtained now for any new purpose without a voter-approved amendment to the Constitution.
One type of bond issue that would never pass under a 60% scenario is low-cost housing assistance. In the modern era, the state has put 5 housing assistance issues on the ballot. 2 have passed, 3 have failed. The 2 that passed with well under 60%, because there's not as broad a buy-in among our general electorate on assisting people with obtaining housing, state participation in lowering the entry cost into housing. And today, affordable housing, every business leader agrees, every labor leader agrees, every governmental agrees. I mean, affordable housing is a crisis in our state and in most states right now. If you would take the state out of participating in helping people get started with that first home. One of those programs several years ago had a component in it specifically for returning veterans, for example, to help them buy their first home. That would be knocked out because at 60%, some things just don't have enough buy-in. It's hard to pass the housing assistance issue, real hard. That's why only 2 out of 5, and the 2 that passed were well under 60. That's the type of thing that would just be off the boards.
Thank you both for your answers. This is a point of clarification. It's come up a couple times. Does the change in the threshold, the 60%, apply to both citizen and legislature constitutional amendments?
Yes.
Yes, although the first version introduced in lame duck session did not. When Representative Stewart introduced the first version of this last November, it would have applied only to citizen-led initiatives and not General Assembly place initiatives. There was a lot of blowback on that about a double standard. One standard for citizens, one standard for the General Assembly. And so in the second iteration that was introduced in January in the new session, it applied to both. So if this gets approved, it will apply to both citizen-led initiatives and General Assembly placed initiatives.
This is where I think legislators are not taking the long-term view. There may be an occasion in the near future where they want to propose an amendment to the voters. And that would be subject to the same 60%, very high bar for approval. So it appears that they're putting this issue on the ballot for certain short-term, whether it's the reproduction rights amendment or whether it's redistricting. If they're taking a very short-term view here in rushing this issue to a low turnout election, and it could come back to bite them in terms of unintended consequences down the road. It's not the long-term view which I believe is in the best interest of Ohio.
Thank you both. Do you think the authors of this bill are concerned about a citizen-led initiative to require a nonpartisan committee to address the current gerrymandering situation?
Mike can start.
He'll love this. He'll love this.
Yeah, nobody in this audience is a little Bo Peep. Of course. In fact, Representative Brian Stewart of Asheville, Northern Pickaway County, wrote a memo that got a lot of attention in the press to his fellow Republican House members in December when it was clear they weren't going to get the votes to get it to the May ballot. And so he said, we're going to reintroduce this in January, the new session, hopefully for later in the year. And the 2 specific instances he mentioned in his memo to House members was, we got to head off this reproductive rights amendment, and we have to head off Maureen O'Connor, who is the centerpiece for putting together a citizens coalition to put before voters, probably in November of next year, 24, an amendment that would create a truly independent citizens redistricting commission like exists in Michigan, like exists in Arizona. There's a handful of states that have done this, and it forever would change the way we draw districts in that politicians would no longer be able to draw their own lines.
I concur with that.
Thank you both. Could this 60% provision ensure that the true interests of the vast majority of Ohioans are represented?
Read that one more time, Nick.
Could this 60% provision, the increased threshold, ensure that the true interests of the vast majority of Ohioans are represented?
Well, that's a talking point of the proponents. You know, the proponents are saying that 60% ensures that there is a supermajority broad consensus for making amendments to the Ohio Constitution. And there are a few states that require 60. Illinois requires 60. Florida requires 60. Colorado's at 55. Those are the only 3 states that require a true supermajority vote beyond a simple majority among the 18 that enable citizen-led initiatives. One point I would make is, to echo a point Governor Taft made, is a state constitution is a living document. This is an 1851 document. There's a lot of things that need to be updated to reflect the times, and the General Assembly is usually putting those on the ballot to update things. The U.S. Constitution is very spare because it reserves only certain rights to the federal government and leaves all the details to the states. That's why all state constitutions are much longer than the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution contains not one word on education, not one word on state judiciaries, not one word on cities, counties, townships, not one word on all sorts of state obligations. So the state constitution must deal with all of those responsibilities, limit powers, define powers, and so forth. And so the Municipal Home Rule Amendment, for example, it was adopted in 1912 to give cities the power to run their own affairs as long as their ordinances don't violate a broad state law. That 1912 amendment had to balance interests between cities and private entities in the provision of utilities. The delegates of that convention wanted to provide cities that were growing up big time in the early 20th century with the authority to build, operate, and own streetcars, electricity plants, gas plants, water and sewer plants. They got that authority in 1912, but in order to keep cities from unduly competing with privately owned, investor-owned utilities, there was a provision put in place that cities could not extend their services too far beyond their own municipal boundaries. Well, that was fine up until the post-war era. When everybody came back from World War II, what did they want? Automobile, some green acres, suburbia became a reality really for the first time in our nation and in our state. Suburbias were blooming, but you can't build houses without water and sewer. And the small package plants could not deal with the scale of the housing boom in suburbs. And so this 1912 Municipal Home Rule Amendment that's limited what cities could do with water and sewer had to be changed because we had a health crisis on our hands. And our health authorities were telling legislators, we need to amend that provision because it's no longer relevant to the reality of where people want to live in this state. And so the legislature had to put an amendment on the ballot in November of 1959 to allow cities to extend water and sewer into the suburbs. That's a living document. You know, what did that pass by? 57%. 60 is hard to get to. Now our health authorities were saying, look, we need potable water out there and we need hygienic, large-scale sewer service. Well, we wouldn't have the suburbs we have today if that didn't pass in 1959 because they would never have gotten their water and sewer out there. Today, Columbus, the water and sewer operation in Columbus serves 33 different jurisdictions. It's a regional water and sewer authority, just like Dayton, Cleveland. They're all regional authorities serving multiple jurisdictions of necessity. One example among many, there's many, many examples of here about why this needs to be a living document that can reflect the times 2023 is a lot different from 1851. There's a lot of 1851 stuff in here, as well as 1912 stuff and 1920 stuff. And legislatures have to ask the voters to amend it from time to time to keep up with the times, to keep a living document. This is not the U.S. Constitution. State constitutions are all living documents that have to be reflective of the times. And the 60%, in my view, will pose some real tough challenges for basic things that, you talk about unintended consequences, we're going to have a challenge on our hands in many, many areas of our governance and our living and our quality of life if we have to meet 60% on every amendment. We all get excited about the hot button issues, but much more, there's a lot more mundane stuff in here that has to do with just how we live every day that will have to change over time. And at 60, it'll just be a lot harder to do.
And don't forget the 88 county requirement too, which may make it almost impossible to get an issue to the ballot.
Thank you both very much. Governor Taft, here's a very polite question. Governor Taft, while I respect your effort to be kind and focus on the August election, please be honest. Is there anything of value in the amendment or in the motivation of those proposing it?
Well, it's providing a great discussion this evening that all of you
I will give proponents their due. I mean, you can have an honest, intellectually honest and engaging discussion about whether a state constitution should have a higher bar than 50% plus one. You can. The proponents point out that Ohio is one of only 18 states that have it, 32 do not. That reflects our history, our pioneer history. If you look at a map of states that allow the citizen-initiated amendment, they're almost all in the Midwest and West. Why? The eastern states were federalist states for the most part, strong central government. The Jeffersonian Republicans and the Jacksonian Democrats that opened up Ohio and opened up the West, they didn't want much to do with strong central government. They wanted to reserve more power to the people. They didn't trust those guys too much. They knew what strong central governments meant. And so our 1802 Constitution and our 1851 Constitution both have lots of provisions in them that reflect that power to the people ethos as part of our political culture, part of our political tradition. If the proponents, and I think many of them are honestly minded about this, think that it's time to change, it's time to require more than 50%, I would engage in that, and I did when I was on the Constitutional Modernization Commission. I was part of a committee that wanted to propose to the full commission, the 32-member commission, an examination of what if we looked at 55%. I never would have gone for 60 because I think 60 causes way too many problems, as I mentioned. But the statutory initiative is seldom used. Ohio has the statutory initiative, the constitutional initiative, and the referendum. 3 tools of direct democracy. The statutory initiative is almost never used. It's only been used 3 times successfully in 111 years. Most recently in 2006, an initiated law to take our indoor spaces smoke-free. Before that, in 1949, to allow producers of oleomargarine to color their product yellow to resemble butter, of all things. And in 1933, to create an old age pension system. So why don't people use the statutory initiative? Because there's no safety in it. If you go to the time and trouble of getting the citizens to pass an initiated law, to put it in the revised code, it can be wiped out by the General Assembly the next day. Many states that give their citizens the initiated statute power also give a safe harbor provision to the initiated statute. So if it's approved, the legislature can't touch it for 5 years, 7 years, whatever, without a supermajority vote. So if you have the statutory initiative that has no safety, and the constitutional initiative, which is in bedrock, what are you going to choose if you want to get something done? And so what the task, I'm sorry I'm going on so long, the context is important here, I think, Nick. The committee of the Constitutional Modernization Commission asked ourselves, how can we incentivize the use of the statutory initiative and disincentivize the use of the constitutional initiative? Because sometimes too many statutory-like provisions do get into the Constitution. My favorite is livestock care standards. Livestock care standards belongs in a revised code, not in the Constitution. Well, so what we proposed to the full 32-member commission to look at was, what about a 55% threshold for constitutional amendments, reachable, not unreachable, in exchange for reforming the statutory initiative to lower the signature requirements and to create a safe harbor provision of 5 years. Make it easier, make it safer. We proposed that to the full 32-member commission, and it got tabled. Why? Because nobody came out in favor of it. Every group that came out to testify, from right to left, didn't like it. Why? I'm not sure. Maybe it was too much too soon. These things take a long learning curve. This is dense stuff. Thank you for putting up with us. So it was tabled. I think if that was taken off the table, and this weren't being a rush job, we could have an extended conversation, engage lots and lots of people around the state about whether there's a compromise here. That wasn't done. My big issue isn't the reproductive rights issue. My big issue isn't minimum wage or ending gerrymandering once and for all. Like everybody else in this room, I have an opinion on those things, and I care about them. My issue is, how do you treat our Constitution? It belongs to us. It belongs to us, we the people. The first two paragraphs say the we the citizens reserve the right to alter, reform, or abolish the Constitution whenever we see fit. Those words mean something. Founders meant those words. And I believe that if this wasn't a rush job like it is, we could have a thorough, prolonged, informative conversation with 11.8 million Ohioans, say what ought we do here? Maybe we would change, maybe we wouldn't change, but in 220 years of statehood, we've never made this a rush job. This is a rush job. That's my concern. You don't rush the most fundamental change in our Ohio Constitution in 111 years to a special August election designed for minimal voter turnout. You do it for maximum voter turnout, so we build consensus. That's my concern. I apologize for the filibuster, but that's what it is.
Thank you, Mike. I think that was a really important context and history, and particularly your experiences on the commission to modernize the Constitution. I think a lot of that was very, very helpful. I'm going to direct this one to, it's kind of a spicy one. Many public statements have been made by members of the legislature admitting that the real motivation for issue 1 is to thwart the November issue on reproductive rights. In effect, the legislature is using $20 million to advance their political agenda. Are there any anti-corruption provisions in the Ohio Constitution that could be the basis for impeachment of these legislators?
Well, I mean, if that's the case, that's a huge defect. You don't change the Ohio Constitution for years to come because of one single issue that happens to be coming up. That's a rush job, as Mike Curtin just described. You know, this is unfortunately, this is politics, not at its best. And this kind of thing does happen and can happen. And it's incumbent upon all of us and as informed voters to understand what's happening and spread the word. And I encourage you to do that as much as you can, because we don't know how this issue is going to come out on August 8th. It's going to be a low turnout, so small number of voters could make the difference, but the more voters that you can, if you believe, as we believe, that this is not the time to do it, that's not good for Ohio's future, then you really need to spread the word through email lists and otherwise.
The key word in that question was corruption. We're witnessing now the prosecution of the biggest bribery scandal in Ohio's history in a federal courtroom in Cincinnati, the Larry Householder et al. Trial, when the FBI special agent in charge unveiled those indictments. He said it was the biggest public corruption trial in the nation. And he said Ohio is, quote, in a league of its own, close quote, when it comes to, corruption. Now, I'm not saying the current state house is corrupt. Larry Householder's gone. The people who are indicted are gone. So I'm not making that claim, but, you know, if I were in the inner circle at the State House advising the leaders of the General Assembly, I'd say, you know, coming off the largest public corruption scandal in our state's history, shouldn't issue number 1 be ethics reform. And when we talk about whether we can shine a light on dark money is legal, but states can do certain things to regulate the reporting of money that goes into politics. And right now, dark money is king, and none of us can see where that money is coming from. And at some point, we, the people, have to solve that problem.
Thank you very much. Next question, I think this one deserves repeating just because it is important to underscore, I think, the importance of the county rule. What would you say to someone who questions why getting signatures from 88 instead of 44 counties is a bad thing?
Well, the proponents, and I'll quote them directly, the proponents say that to amend the Ohio Constitution, it should involve every corner of Ohio, all 88 counties. Many of those small counties feel neglected. There's some merit in that. They don't get much attention, and one might make a valid case. And if you look at a scattergram of where state resources go, where state investments go, you can make a case that we don't pay the poorest areas, the most needy areas of Ohio, the respect they're due. That is a long and involved, investigation in and of itself about how we apportion resources in this state. But, I think the current requirements, the current signature gathering requirements do go statewide. You don't have quotas in all 88 counties, but you do have signature gathering in darn near all those counties. And, and as I said before, an 88 county requirement requiring that 5% threshold would, in my view, and this was Frank LaRosa's testimony late last year until he changed, that he would not support an 88 county requirement because it would only empower special interests who have the deep, deep pockets to hire all those circulators to cover more than 44 counties. It's already a high, high burden. As I said, no state in the nation has an all-county requirement. That is a high, high bar, and I think there's a reason they're trying to make it a high, high bar.
It also raises, as we were chatting earlier, a one person, one vote issue, which could go into the court. If you've got a very small number of citizens in one county, that could block the ability of the rest of the state to vote on an issue, then you're giving extraordinary power to that very small group of voters. So it's challengeable. I'm not sure that would prevail, but I think it's a potential violation of one person, one vote.
Well, to Governor Taft's point, last year the Michigan State Supreme Court knocked out Michigan's geographic-based signature requirements as a violation of one person, one vote. One person, one vote, one signature, one person, one signature, that an 88 county requirement, or even a far less stern requirement that Michigan had, was violative of one person, one vote in that court's judgment. And the Constitutional Revision Commission that existed from 1970 to 77, in its final report to the legislature in 1977, recommended abolishing Ohio's existing 44 county requirement on the same argument. So that is litigible for sure.
Thank you. If this passes, if issue 1 passes, could it be nearly impossible to overturn it because of its same rules and the requirement that would be elevated?
That's a problem. But
When you look at both General Assembly placed issues and, well, let's just take a look at General Assembly placed issues and set aside citizen-led initiatives. When they get over 60, it's when both parties support them. There's no organized opposition, and you have business-labor agreement. That's when you get over 60, when you have unity. If you have organized opposition that means anything, that has access to money, you're not going to get to 60%.
Thank you. And last question from the crowd. With time still changing, some may argue the decision made over 100 years ago is outdated. If issue 1 isn't the change or the answer that Ohio needs for this particular change that proponents of it are asking for, what do you propose is the answer? I
think that answer needs to come from the people. You know, I think a bona fide, honest attempt to find the answer to that has to be a classic town hall, county by county, city by city exercise where you educate people as to the options, you get feedback, and you see where the people are. The people own this. You own this Constitution. If we're going to make fundamental change, you need to be part of the, idea mongering, part of the thought process that goes into it. We need a broad participation in this sort of thing, and that's what the Constitutional Modernization Commission tried to do. We didn't get throngs of people coming to our meetings for sure, Bob, but that's what we tried to do. That same Article 2 of our Constitution that creates initiative and referendum gives that same power to every municipality in the state. So we have between 180 and 200 or so cities and several hundred villages in the state of Ohio with municipal initiative and referendum powers. And so, if we're going to start curbing what people can do at the state level, is the next step, start curbing what people can do in their own cities and villages. We don't focus on that much, they're not used that much, but it's the same article of Article 2 of the Constitution that grants the power for you statewide on the Constitution and people in municipalities for their city charters and their city ordinances. And so this needs to be a thorough, wide-ranging discussion that involves citizen education and citizen feedback.
I would certainly support that, and I'm just not certain that the system is currently that broken. I think we should support the initiative and the referendum and the ability of people to check legislative power when necessary or to revise public policy in a state like Ohio. I don't think it's been that abused. I think the people, when they're educated on an issue, have the ability to make the right decision with the simple majority that currently exists. So we can always look at our Constitution, but I'm not sure that there's a dramatic need right now to change what Ohio law currently is.
Another way to say that is nobody asked for this.
Thank you both for your fantastic responses so far. I'm going to kind of wrap things up. Mike, would you mind giving us just a 30-second final thought?
I was co-sponsor of the anti-special interest amendment in 2015 that passed with 51.3% of the vote. In 2015, Ohioans voted to make it difficult, if not impossible, for the initiative power of this state to be used by any person, any entity to create a special benefit for themselves. In the 8 years since passage of that, not one special interest has come to Ohio's doorstep trying to surmount that anti-special interest wall. And so therefore, the argument that we need to do the 60% to keep the special interests out is false. Ohioans closed and locked that door in November of 2015.
Thank you, Mike. Governor Taft, would you mind closing it out with your final thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming and for being willing to educate yourself about what's a pretty complicated issue, but hopefully will become more clear to voters as we get closer to August 8th. And as I already mentioned, I just encourage you to get the word out. This could pass, and I think it would be a very bad thing for Ohio. Please do what you can to tap your email list, your groups. Remember that you can to spread the word why this is not good for Ohio going forward, and to encourage people to vote and to vote no.
Thank you both very much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. That was a masterful job. This is a tough audience here. And thank you, Governor Taft and Michael Curtin, for your participation this evening. At this time, I'd like to welcome Jen Miller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much. So this was a bipartisan conversation with a former Republican and a former Democrat elected official. It's been produced by two nonpartisan groups, the Dayton Daily News and the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And these times it can be hard to find bipartisan agreement on an issue. And it's very rare for the League of Women Voters to be so public against a ballot issue. And that's because this is beyond party. This is our freedom to make policies that improve our daily lives. And I'm just going to point out a couple that I think are, no one would argue with now, that passed by less than 60%, which is integrating the Ohio National Guard first with people of color and then women. Neither of those at the time passed by 60%. They would today. And sometimes that's why these issues matter so much. We got a lot of questions about the campaign. And so that's why I'm going to go ahead and answer a few of those now. If you want to know more about the campaign, go to knowinaugust.org. We have 200 organizations standing in opposition, potentially representing millions of Ohio voters. There's a media tour going on right now across the state. I've been traveling all over the state, and these conversations have been with firefighters, cops, teachers, nurses, good government groups, faith leaders, all standing opposed. The No campaign launched its ads today. The Yes campaign doesn't have ads yet, so we beat them to the punch. The League of Women Voters of Dayton has also been working very hard. There are festivals and parades, they're doing postcard parties, we'll have yard signs next week. There's been supply chain issues, so you gotta be patient with us. There aren't very many yard signs either direction right now, but we'll have ours next week. This Thursday, there is an event in Cincinnati, if you'd like to go to that. Again, you can go to knowinaugust.org and you can find out about that. What can you do? First, please be a poll worker. Please support your Board of Elections. They're going through some hard times. And as much as I disagree with having an August election for this reason, I encourage every single one of you to be a poll worker, because if we are short poll workers, it's our boards of elections and our voters who hurt. I encourage you to join the League. I encourage you to support the Dayton Daily News. I encourage you to follow all of us on social media. And we have something called the Mind+9, which is the idea that you are going to make sure that you know everything you need to know to vote. We have new voting laws. Polling locations have changed. Quite a few will have changed. We have ID rules now. So make sure you do your research. Make sure you vote your conscience. That's yours. And let's increase turnout tenfold by checking in with 9 of your friends and family members and loved ones. It's an honor. It's an utter honor to work for the League of Women Voters, because voters are our North Star. That's why we don't take positions that often. But this one is fundamental for all of us. And the pendulum could swing the other way. So if someone is incredibly conservative here, they might decide that our state has gone too far, too liberal, and one day want to use the constitutional amendment process too. This is about our ability, our freedom to pick up our clipboards, to collect signatures, to get something on the ballot, and convince Ohioans that a policy is needed to improve our daily lives. And that's why we are so grateful to these 2 dignitaries. We're so grateful to our partners, Dayton Daily News, and grateful to all of you. And with that, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for coming down and supporting our efforts to make sure that we educate the people in our community. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us this evening. If you have any questions, feel free to contact the League office at league@lwvdayton.org or give us a call. On your way out, take literature, take a button, and if you are so inclined, make a donation. most of all, spread the word and vote on August 8th. Thank you.